I'm Peter Block in Anaheim, California at the AHA annual meeting for On the Scene. With me to my left is Deepak Bhatt from the Brigham and Women's in Boston, and my far left, Tony DeMaria, an old friend from San Diego. And we are redoing day 3, the wrap-up. So we have a couple of trials we want to talk about today, guys. Redual PCI and Compass, and I think we'll start with Redual PCI. So this is a subgroup analysis, dabigatran versus warfarin triple therapy, dabigatran plus aspirin. And the question is whether or not that is or is not better than the triple therapy. So comments?
Sure. So, the main paper had been published already in New England Journal. This was examining some of the subgroups, such as ACS patients versus non-ACS, bare metal versus drug-eluting stent, the ticagrelor subgroup, which isn't huge, but still, a bit over 400 patients. And the bottom line is the results here were consistent with the overall paper. That is, a lot less bleeding with double therapy, with the dabigatran regimens, versus full-dose triple therapy, that is aspirin, clopidogrel, full-dose warfarin. So consistent with the overall trial, consistent with the Pioneer trial conceptually, that full-dose triple therapy, aspirin, clopidogrel, warfarin, just causes a ton of bleeding, and it's not clear that that results in any meaningful efficacy.
Okay, so we were looking at this before and talking about whether or not clinically now this changes the way we do things. Deepak, you're changing already. You've already changed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't use full-dose triple therapy. I think the way to go is either a NOAC or warfarin with clopidogrel, aspirin in the hospital, but stop it on discharge. I think in general that's a safer approach. Are there some high-risk subgroups where you might be careful? Well, one bit of insight from the Redual analyses, especially in the ACS patients, the lower dabigatran dose, numerically there was a sign of more ischemic events. So less bleeding, but a price to pay. So it's a matter, I think, of tailoring therapy. For most patients, if you're using dabigatran, for example, this trial would suggest to go with the 150, but you might consider the lower dosing in places where it's available. The specific dose here isn't available easily in the US for the lower dose dabigatran. But it's a matter of weighing the trade-offs between ischemic and bleeding events.
Tony, your thoughts?
So I think in people who are at very high risk to bleed, that the 150 were it available would be very attractive. For some of us, Peter, the ability to quantify the warfarin effect with an INR is very appealing. Giving dabigatran even at 150, one is never quite sure what the effect is going to be, but nevertheless the data are quite compelling that clearly this approach is better than triple therapy as it currently is.
I would agree.
practiced.
The INR may be great, but the INR varies so much in my patients, I'm going to give it up as well.
Well, one other thing in Redual, in the overall trial results, is there was significantly less intracranial hemorrhage with the double therapy. Happened to be with dabigatran, but I think it could be extrapolated to the other NOACs versus full-dose triple therapy. So it's not just bleeding in general, it includes the really bad bleeding that is increased with full-dose triple therapy.
Okay, let's move on. There is another trial, Compass, rivaroxaban, low dose versus rivaroxaban, higher dose. This is peripheral disease and coronary disease plus or minus aspirin. An interesting study where the outcomes were primarily MACE plus also some peripheral outcomes. Tony, do you want to just take that one?
So this was a group of patients with CAD, stable CAD, or PAD, or both, of course. So that traditionally what most of us have done in these patients is aspirin. That's recommended. And the question was, if you added DOAC, specifically in this case rivaroxaban, would you further reduce events? And of course the study was positive, especially at the lower dose at 2.5. It was not so positive at 5, and the lack of dose responsiveness needs to be explained. That remains a question. Here in this particular sub-analysis, they looked at the cost benefit. Couldn't do cost effectiveness because we don't have a price for the lower dose of rivaroxaban. In fact, it's not even available yet. And not surprisingly, in one of those who's buried in Grant's tomb questions, if you reduce events, surprisingly, you reduce cost, and that's exactly what they found. So again, more evidence that I think for most of us, when the lower dose of Riva becomes available, probably we will use it in these patients with CAD, PAD.
But it's important to say plus aspirin, right? Because the 5
Yes.
milligrams of rivaroxaban
Right.
did not have an aspirin in that group, and that made a difference because the lower dose was better. My takeaway from this is if you're going to give a NOAC, you've got to give aspirin as well. Would you agree with that?
Well, so it depends. Just to be clear with the audience, this isn't an AFib trial like Redul was.
No,
These
I
are
get that.
stable CAD and PAD, and here aspirin plus a very low dose of rivaroxaban, much lower, a quarter of the dose of the AFib dose, seem to be a great strategy. And what this new analysis shows is that the costs associated with things like amputations and ischemic strokes are quite high. Those events were reduced in this study.
So reduce cost.
Yeah.
Well, as I said, typically all of us use aspirin now, right? Aspirin use in these patients is well over 95%. So this is adding on the Riva, as you pointed out.
Okay, 2 good trials for day number 3. Thank you.